The courtroom hummed with its usual hushed expectancy, lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering, the distant clang of a gavel echoing from another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her expression serene and professional. Another day, another case, or so she thought, until the bailiff announced the case, State of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly, her hands resting on the polished wood. The defendant's name, followed by a litany of charges, assault, robbery, resisting arrest, sent a familiar ache through her chest. Another lost soul, she thought. Then the defendant was brought into the room, and her world tilted on its axis. The man before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was no stranger. It was James Anderson, her James. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories engulfed her. Summers spent cycling through the streets of Hammond, Louisiana. Long talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard. Childhood promises of unwavering support, no matter the hardship. But the man before her was not the boy she remembered. His shoulders were slumped, his face etched with years of suffering, yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Eleanor felt her hand falter as she reached for the gavel. For the first time in her career she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as she struggled to process the impossible. James looked at her, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, bowing his head in a gesture of respect. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson, you are charged with assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice, raspy and almost unrecognizable, replied, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Eleanor's heart pounded. She wanted to halt proceedings, demand explanations, understand what had happened to him. How had he ended up here? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. The prosecutor began his opening statement, and her mind raced. This wasn't just another case. It was James. And somehow she needed to separate her past from her present before it was too late. As the trial progressed, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the past. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, not separated by distance, but by the unspoken rigid rules of their segregated town. Her family's home was modest, a single-story building with a white picket fence. James's was down a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship was an anomaly. She remembered their first meeting, a hot afternoon when she had wandered too far and ended up near a creek. James was fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She offered to help, and that simple gesture began a friendship marked by shared secrets and dreams. She remembered James's words, lying in the grass under the stars, asking if she'd ever thought of leaving. He wanted to go somewhere where people wouldn't look at them with suspicion just for being together. Eleanor had laughed then, dismissing it as fanciful, but James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place with no room for people like him. Their friendship, however, didn't withstand the weight of societal expectations. It ended the summer before high school, when her father caught them together on the porch. His voice was cold, authoritative. "Eleanor, come inside." She hesitated, looking at James, who stood still, as if waiting for a signal. He stepped back and said, with a resigned tone, "Go on, I'll see you around." But she didn't see him again, not in the same way. Her father forbade her from seeing James, and soon after, his family moved away. Eleanor dedicated herself to school, immersing herself in her studies, pursuing a dream of justice and impartiality. But she never forgot the boy who taught her what courage was. Now sitting on the bench, she tried to understand how James had reached this point. His criminal record showed a series of minor infractions: petty theft, vagrancy, nothing to suggest a violent nature. But then, how much of a life can one understand from a few lines on a criminal record? The prosecutor, back in the present, detailed the charges. James had allegedly assaulted a cashier during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The employee suffered minor injuries and the cash register was taken. James was apprehended a few blocks from the scene, with the money allegedly still in his possession. Eleanor watched James as the prosecutor continued. His posture was slumped, his hands clasped in front of him, and his face was expressionless. Did he really do it, or was there more to the story than the prosecutor was saying? The lunch break gave her a moment to reflect. On returning to her chambers, her assistant Margaret found her with a cautious expression. "Your Honor, are you all right?" "You seem a little distracted," she asked. Eleanor hesitated. Should she open up? Would it be appropriate to admit she knew the defendant? She opted to deny it. "I'm fine, just deep in thought," she replied. But she wasn't fine. How could she be, with the past so deeply buried laid bare before her? When the trial resumed, the courtroom was full again. Reporters scribbled notes, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a stern-faced man named Richard Powell, was ready to present his case. "Members of the jury," Powell began, his voice firm, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent cashier, stealing the money." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's approach was cold, as if James was just another name on a list. She looked at him. He kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He hadn't looked at her once since the trial began. The defense lawyer, Lisa Porter, rose to present her opening statement. She was young, but her presence was commanding. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is straightforward, but it isn't. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the outset. We will prove there's more to this story, that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest don't stand up to scrutiny." The first witness was called, a cashier from the store. He described the man who allegedly attacked the employee, stating the assailant was wearing a red hoodie. His testimony seemed rehearsed. Lisa questioned him with precision. "You stated the man was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" "Yes, that's what I saw," the witness replied. "And did you see his face clearly?" "No. It was dark, and he had the hood up." "So you can't say for certain it was my client, can you?" Lisa said, stepping forward. The man hesitated. "Well, no, I can't." Lisa smiled slightly, concluding the line of questioning. Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in James's posture. His slump relaxed, as if that small moment of doubt gave him some hope. The next piece of evidence was a security video from the store. The footage was grainy, poorly lit, and showed a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecutor claimed it was James, but the image quality made it difficult to identify definitive features. During the viewing, Eleanor focused on the image. Could it be him? The man in the footage moved quickly, grabbing something from the counter before disappearing. The video cut off abruptly, leaving a disquieting gap in the narrative. The defense presented an alibi. James claimed he was going to a friend's house at the time of the crime, but the friend refused to testify, fearing reprisals from the community. Lisa argued that the lack of a witness shouldn't prejudice James's innocence. However, the jury seemed skeptical. The pressure on Eleanor mounted. She knew her role was to be impartial, but each moment of the trial brought up memories and feelings that made this increasingly difficult. She had to decide not only on James's guilt or innocence, but also on the impact of the judicial system on his life. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor remained on the bench, her fingers lightly touching the gavel. She wanted to speak to James, ask him directly what had happened, but knew this would compromise her position. She watched as he was escorted out of the room, handcuffed. For the first time, she doubted the system she believed to be infallible. The next witness was Police Constable Daniel Harris, the officer responsible for James's arrest. Eleanor leaned forward, attentive to any discrepancies. Lisa asked a series of questions, deconstructing the accuracy of Harris's testimony. He had arrested James based solely on a vague description. There was no physical evidence linking James to the crime. The officer appeared uncomfortable, and his credibility was shaken. The defense further presented a forensic expert who analyzed the security footage, showing that the image was inconclusive. The timestamp on the video had been altered, raising doubts about its authenticity. An uneasy silence filled the room. Finally, James was called to testify. Despite the risks, he insisted. His voice, frail but sincere, resonated in the room. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people. But I didn't do this. I was going home when the police stopped me. They didn't ask anything. They just decided I was guilty." James's words were a plea not just for justice, but for humanity. Eleanor felt a pressure in her chest, the pain of recognizing the injustice he had suffered. She looked at the jury. It was clear this wasn't a simple case of evidence. It was a battle for truth, a fight against the prejudices that had shaped both James's and Eleanor's lives. The trial proceeded with closing arguments. The prosecutor clung to circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the process. Lisa asked them to look beyond the evidence and recognize James's humanity. As the jury retired to deliberate, Eleanor sat alone, pondering the responsibility she carried. The jury's decision came after hours of deliberation. The silence in the room was palpable as the court clerk read the verdict. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find him not guilty. The room erupted in murmurs. James relaxed, but his face remained impassive. He had won his freedom, but there was something deeper in his expression, a weariness that couldn't be ignored. Eleanor, her voice firm, declared, "The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go." Court is adjourned. After the public departed, Eleanor remained behind. As James approached to sign his release, he looked at her. "You don't owe me anything, but I want to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor felt the lump in her throat, the words weighing heavily. "Because I couldn't. I needed to be fair. If I spoke, I could compromise everything." James looked at her with a mixture of pain and understanding. "Fair," he repeated. "Yes, that's what we always say. But the world's never been fair, not for people like me." Eleanor lowered her head, the words forming with difficulty. "I know. I'm so sorry." James gave a slight nod, accepting the pain, and walked away, disappearing through the courthouse doors. Eleanor remained there, alone, reflecting. She had fulfilled her duty as a judge, but James's trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just in verdicts or evidence, but in the lives the system affected. She had done her part, but now knew her mission was far greater than simply following the law. She had to strive for a fairer, more humane system for everyone. As she left the courthouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the steps. Eleanor made a silent promise to herself. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything possible to ensure the future was fairer. Perhaps it would be difficult. Perhaps it would be impossible. But she owed it to James and to herself. Eleanor walked slowly through the empty courthouse corridors, her steps heavy, as if each movement were burdened by a weight she never imagined carrying. The doors closed behind her with a soft but definite sound. Outside, night was slowly falling, and the lights of Baton Rouge twinkled in the distance, indifferent to the dilemmas she had faced that day. The sun no longer illuminated the steps, and the sky had turned a deep blue, dotted with a few stars that barely managed to pierce the city's artificial light. She got into her car and closed the door with a deep sigh. The cold leather seat seemed to reflect her loneliness, and she allowed herself to sit there for a moment, hands on the wheel, not knowing exactly where to go. The day had been long, exhausting, but something still burned in her chest. James was free, but what remained for her? What would happen when she went home alone, without another case to decide, without another sentence to pronounce? She knew the judicial system, with all its structure and rules, was important, but she also knew it didn't solve everything. It didn't heal the deep wounds that formed within people. It didn't provide answers to questions that couldn't be asked within the courthouse walls. What James had said, with that contained pain, still echoed in her mind. The world's never been fair, not for people like me. How could Eleanor deny it? She had delivered justice, yes, but she also knew that James's life had been marked by a system that didn't see him, that judged him before even understanding who he truly was. She no longer wanted to be just a judge who dictated cold, impersonal sentences. She wanted to be something more. But what, exactly? She didn't know. Not yet. The city blurred past as the car moved through the streets, but nothing seemed as clear as before. The thought that her life had always been built on what she could control, on the choices she made, seemed to crumble. She found herself thinking of those childhood moments, of her friendship with James, of the love he showed the world despite everything. James had always known the world wouldn't be easy for him, but he still believed in something. She wondered if he still believed. What remained of him, and what remained of her? When she arrived home, the light was off. It was late, and the house seemed too silent, as if time had stopped inside. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she placed her bag on the table and removed her shoes. The house, which was once the place of so many promises and dreams, now seemed like a capsule, isolated from the world outside. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. The streetlights illuminated the empty pavement, and the cool night air carried the scent of wet earth. Eleanor wondered if, somehow, she was heading in the right direction. There was something in her heart that still felt the pain of not having done more, of not having helped James when he needed it most. The thought led her to reflect on the moments when she and James had drifted apart, how their love, though not romantic, had been strong, unbreakable in its essence. They were children and didn't know what the future held, but they promised to always support each other. And she had kept her promise up to that point. But James, what did he think of all this? What did he feel when he looked at her, now, as a judge? She knew that, however impartial she had been in her decision, the pain of their lost friendship would never disappear. Not now. Not after all he had been through. Not after all she still had to do to understand what justice truly meant. Eleanor sat on the sofa, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. The conversations she'd had with Margaret during the day, the way the prosecutor's words resonated in her mind, and most importantly, the way Lisa Porter had dismantled each part of the prosecution's case. The defense had shown the flaws in the case, but what touched her most was the way James had spoken in court. He was tired, not just physically but emotionally, as if he had reached the limit of his fight against the world. Eleanor wondered if she had done enough for him, to give him the chance he truly deserved, not just in court, but in his life. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She looked at the screen and saw Margaret's name flashing. Sighing, Eleanor answered. "Eleanor?" Margaret's voice sounded worried. "I just wanted to know how you are. You seemed overwhelmed today." Eleanor smiled faintly, but it was a tired smile. "I'm fine, Margaret. Just needing some time to reflect, you know." Margaret didn't sound convinced. "You don't sound fine to me." "Eleanor, I know you care about what happens, but you can't carry it all alone. You have a life outside the courtroom." Eleanor sighed, the weight of her thoughts once again taking over. "I know, but today was difficult. I just don't know how to deal with all of this, you know? James's life, the choices he made, mine. What will he do now? How will he move on after all this?" "I don't know," replied Margaret, "but I know you did what you could. James now has a chance to start over, and you gave him that. It's not easy, Eleanor, and I know you're still processing all of this, but you did the right thing." Eleanor was silent for a moment, allowing Margaret's words to settle in her mind. She was trying to be rational, trying to convince herself that she had done what was right. But what about the mistakes and the things she hadn't done, the missed opportunities? "I don't know," Eleanor murmured. "I just wish things were different. It's not fair, that his life has been so hard." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "It's not fair. But, Eleanor, you're not to blame for that. His world was built on the circumstances he grew up in, and as much as you want to change that, you can't do it alone. What you can do is help him have a chance now. And you did that." Eleanor leaned back on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. Margaret was right in a way. She couldn't change the past, but perhaps in time she could find a way to help other people, to fight against the system that allowed lives like James's to be lost in the darkness. "I just hope he can find a path now. That he knows there's something more for him than this," Eleanor said, her voice softer. "He will, Eleanor. He has you, in one way or another. You had given him what he needed, the chance to be heard." Eleanor put down the phone and stood there for a while in silence, thinking. The world wasn't fair, she knew that, but perhaps it was possible to change something, however small, every day. She didn't know what the next step would be, but for the first time, she felt a renewed determination. She wouldn't just be a judge. She would be someone who fought for the truth, for justice, and most importantly, for humanity. She rose from the sofa and went to the window, gazing out into the darkness of the night. She knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, but at least now she had something more, the certainty that true justice wasn't about following the rules, but about understanding that each life, each story, had its weight and its value. She had the power to make a difference, and she would. Perhaps it would be difficult, perhaps it would be impossible, but she wouldn't give up, not anymore. She looked out towards the horizon, where the city lights twinkled, and made a silent promise to herself. She would do what it took to make the world a little fairer, starting with people like James, and she would start now. Eleanor remained standing at the window for a long time, simply observing the city lights in the distance. The sounds of the city seemed far away, as if she were in a world apart. Her heart was still heavy, but somehow she felt more aware of her mission. The court had closed its doors for the day, but her mind continued to race. The trial of James Anderson had affected her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The judge in her, who had always known how to control her emotions, was now facing a chasm she didn't know how to cross. She had always believed that justice lay in upholding the rules, in the impartiality of decisions, but that vision seemed more limited now. She had seen the system's effects on James, and she couldn't ignore them. However necessary the laws, however just the sentences in their essence, James's life showed the system's flaws, the gaps that no one wanted to see. He had been judged before being truly heard, and what bothered her most was that she had been part of it. She too had contributed to this limited vision of justice, even unintentionally. She sighed and moved away from the window, walking slowly through the house, as if each step were necessary to reconnect with the world around her. But, looking around, she didn't feel at home. She felt that her home was elsewhere, far away, where the promises of the past were still alive. She wondered if James felt the same thing, if he too saw himself as lost, trying to find his place in a world that had never fully accepted him. He had been a hopeful child, but life had shaped him in a cruel way. Eleanor stopped in front of the mirror on the living room wall, observing her own reflection. She was a judge now, a figure of authority, but what did she truly represent? She looked at herself more closely, trying to see beyond the formal clothes, the neatly tied hair, and the imposing posture. She wondered where she had left the young woman who, one day, ran through the streets of Hammond, dreaming of something greater. She had lost herself in this role, in the weight of responsibilities, and perhaps now it was time to rediscover who she really was. She picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed her mother's number. The conversation she had with Margaret was still fresh in her mind, but something inside her said she needed to talk to someone closer, someone who could see her not just as the judge she had become, but as the daughter she still was. The phone rang for a few seconds until her mother answered. "Eleanor, my darling, how are you?" Her mother's voice sounded gentle but full of concern. "I'm fine, Mum," Eleanor replied, trying to hide the weight of the conversation still on her mind. "Just a bit tired. That trial today was harder than I imagined." Her mother was silent for a moment, as if she knew exactly what her daughter was feeling. "I know, my dear. I know it's difficult. But you've been strong for so long, and you've always done what's right. You remember what I always told you, don't you?" Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered her mother's words from when she was young, starting her journey as a law student, full of dreams and hopes. "You told me that true justice isn't just about following the rules, but about understanding people's hearts, that you should never lose sight of who you are when trying to do the right thing." Her mother's voice sounded softer now, as if she were trying to comfort her from afar. "Yes, my daughter, that's it. You have that gift, Eleanor. You know how to listen to people. You feel what they feel. Don't get lost in the paperwork and the duties. Don't get lost in what people expect of you. Always remember who you are, and justice will be done, no matter the path you take." Eleanor felt a knot unravel in her chest at these words. She knew her mother was right. She had always known it. But the pressure of her work, of her responsibilities, had made her forget this simple truth. She had lost part of herself in the pursuit of perfection in court. But now, perhaps, it was time to reassess everything. "I've been thinking a lot about that, Mum. About what happened with James, about what it really means to do justice. I don't know anymore if I'm doing enough." Her mother sighed on the other end of the line, and Eleanor could almost hear the smile in her voice. "You did what you could. The rest is not in your hands. The system is large, Eleanor. You can't change everything at once, but you can change how you deal with it. You can bring something new. You've already started doing that. Don't give up on yourself now." Eleanor smiled with a lighter heart, her mother's words sinking deep into her soul. She knew what she needed to do, knew the path wouldn't be easy, but now she had the strength to continue. What she could do was listen more, see beyond the evidence and the sentences, and perhaps somehow make the system more human, more compassionate. Perhaps it wouldn't be a radical change, but she could start with small steps. A lifetime's work, perhaps. She said goodbye to her mother, thanking her for the comforting words, and hung up the phone. She stood there, looking at the emptiness of the room. Something inside her was different now. Perhaps it was the feeling that her journey was only just beginning. She looked towards the front door, as if she could see beyond the street, beyond the horizon, and saw a future full of possibilities. It wouldn't be easy, she knew that, but she had the strength and determination to move forward. The following morning, Eleanor arrived at the courthouse with a new sense of purpose. The James Anderson trial had left an indelible mark on her, but now she knew what she needed to do. The court wasn't just a place of laws and sentences. It was a place where lives were shaped, where stories were told, and where sometimes the truth lay not just in the evidence, but in the emotions and experiences of the people who passed through there. She looked at the judge's bench and felt that more than ever, that bench was her place. She was there to serve justice, but also to humanize it, to ensure that the system she defended could, in fact, help people, instead of simply condemning them. She sat down on the bench and looked towards the courtroom door, hoping that the next case would be just another opportunity to try to make a difference. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. Perhaps it wouldn't be easy, but she would certainly try, and that was a start. When the door opened and the next case was called, Eleanor looked at the defendant, observing him with more attention than she ever had before. It wasn't just the evidence that mattered. It wasn't just the rules. It was each person's story, the choices they made, and the reasons behind them. And in doing so, perhaps she could finally understand what justice truly meant. She was no longer just fulfilling her role. She was experiencing true justice, one that wasn't confined to paperwork, but touched the souls of people. The court was in full swing that morning. Eleanor watched from her seat on the bench as each part of the judicial process ran its course. The atmosphere was tense, as always, but there was something different about her, something more focused and mindful. She knew that the system, with its rules and laws, was complex, and that it didn't always manage to capture the essence of a person. This didn't stop her from working within it, but it made her constantly question how she could make her function more humane, more empathetic. The first case of the day was simple, at least on its surface. A young man accused of shoplifting from a convenience store with seemingly clear evidence against him. The prosecution had already presented all its main points. The young man was caught on CCTV, the description matched, and he had been found nearby with some of the stolen goods. The defense argued that he had been a victim of circumstance, that necessity had driven him to the crime. But for Eleanor, it wasn't just another case of clear evidence and easy answers. She looked at the young man, who was sitting in the defendant's chair, his eyes downcast, as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. She didn't just see a potential criminal. She saw someone with a story that hadn't yet been told. She remembered how James had looked with that resigned expression, awaiting the judgment of his own life. Would he, in that same situation, not have been equally lost? When the defense began its arguments, Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the lawyer, observing the gestures and words with renewed attention. The lawyer, although experienced, seemed more concerned with the evidence than with his client's story. He spoke of a difficult life, of a youth full of mistakes, but without truly exploring the defendant's pain or motivations. Eleanor realized that as a judge, she couldn't make the defense for him, but perhaps it was her responsibility to give him the opportunity to tell his side of the story. The young man finally stood up to testify. His voice trembled, but he didn't hesitate. He spoke of his childhood in a poor neighborhood, where the lack of prospects and the constant fear of being left behind had shaped his choices. He didn't want to be a criminal, but at some point he had believed there was no other way. "I know what I did is wrong, but I was desperate. I had no one else to help me," he said, his eyes welling up. Eleanor found herself back in that moment when James, sitting in the same position, had spoken similar words. The ache in her chest intensified. The defense concluded with an emotional appeal, and the prosecutor then rose to reinforce the accusation. He pointed out the evidence with precision and clarity, but Eleanor knew that, for him, the case was just a set of pieces to be fitted together, a problem to be solved. She couldn't help but notice the distance between the coldness with which the prosecutor treated the case and the humanity of the defendant, who found himself lost in his own choices. Eleanor retired to deliberate, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about James. How would he have reacted to this trial, to this kind of situation? He hadn't had the chance to defend himself as this young man had. For him, the system seemed to have closed its doors before he even understood what was happening. And yet, it was he who made her realize that justice isn't limited to what is apparent. Sometimes it was necessary to see beyond the surface, to look at the motivations, the mistakes, the human failings. The verdict in that case wasn't straightforward. The evidence was there, but Eleanor felt she couldn't simply go with the flow. She sat, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. It was easy to give a sentence based on the rules, but how could she be just if she didn't understand the true story behind each accusation? She knew the system wasn't perfect, but she also knew that a judge's role wasn't just to be a guardian of the laws. She should be a champion of humanity within them. When the court returned for the reading of the verdict, Eleanor spoke, not with her usual formality, but with a certain gentleness. She spoke about the need to consider the circumstances, the life history, and the pain that shapes each person. Instead of proceeding directly to a conviction, she suggested a rehabilitation program. A path where the young man could learn to make better decisions, to rebuild his life, something he'd never had the chance to do before. She knew this wouldn't solve all the problems, but it could be a start to something more. The verdict was given, and the young man was sentenced to a reduced term, with the possibility of participating in a social reintegration program. Eleanor felt relief, but also a sense that her journey was only just beginning. She didn't know how she would make a difference in all the cases that came before her, but she knew that on that day she had done something different, and that was what mattered. After the trial, she retreated to her chambers. Sitting behind her desk, she looked at the papers in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about what would come next. She knew she couldn't change everything at once, but something inside her said she was beginning to understand the true essence of justice. She wasn't just a judge applying the law. She was someone who should listen, understand, and above all, humanize the system. This required courage, and Eleanor felt she was beginning to find it. She picked up her pen, ready to begin writing her thoughts. But before she could put the nib to the paper, the sound of footsteps broke her concentration. She looked towards the door and saw Margaret entering with a hesitant smile. "How was it, Eleanor?" she asked, knowing the judge was probably still processing everything that had happened. Eleanor smiled back, but this time it was a calm smile, as if, finally, she had found some peace. "It was different," she replied. "I did something I'd never done before, and I feel it was the start of something important." Margaret watched her for a moment, and, noticing the sincerity in Eleanor's eyes, she knew something had changed. The judge was no longer just a defender of the law. She was beginning to be a defender of the people who fell through the cracks of the system. It was a small change, perhaps, but a significant one. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city once more. She still had much to do, much to learn, but something inside her felt lighter. The weight of responsibility was still there, but now she knew how to carry it. She knew that true justice wasn't a matter of blindly following rules, but of understanding what they really meant for those who were being judged. And she was prepared to continue learning day after day, step by step, until the system was, finally, something more humane. She took one last look at the city, where the sun was beginning to set, and felt a renewed determination. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but now at least she knew she could face it with a clearer vision of who she truly wanted to be. With a deep sigh, she returned to the table and picked up her pen, ready to begin writing again. No longer with the intention of simply following cases, but with the desire to create something better, fairer, something that was, in fact, capable of bringing about the true transformation the system needed. Eleanor spent the following days reflecting on the events of the court and the impact it would have on her life. It wasn't easy to balance emotions with reason, and although she knew the system had flaws, she still believed it could be a force for good. The difference, however, lay in how she approached the cases. She could no longer look at each accusation and each piece of evidence with the same impassive eyes as before. Something had changed. She was learning to look at each story in a deeper way, trying to understand the human motivations behind the mistakes, the choices, and most importantly, the consequences. Every time a new case arrived, she looked at it with a renewed sense of empathy. She tried to imagine what those people had been through, the tortuous paths that had led them to that point, and how she could help them within the bounds of the law. The judicial system was still an important structure, but now she felt her role was more than just applying the law. It was her responsibility to make justice something that reflected the complexity of human life. In one of the subsequent trials, she came across a domestic violence case. The defendant was a woman who had assaulted her husband after years of psychological and physical abuse. The prosecution sought to emphasize the assault as the main focus of the case, while the defense presented the context of the pain and suffering the woman had endured. Eleanor listened attentively, without rushing to form an opinion, and when the defendant spoke, she realized that once again, she wasn't just dealing with what was in the evidence, but with a story of struggle, of survival. The woman, her eyes full of tears, spoke about the years of abuse that had silenced her, about the constant fear that one day something more terrible would happen. She spoke of the pain, but she also spoke of her internal struggle, of the moment she decided she could no longer live in fear. She hadn't acted out of malice, but out of necessity. Eleanor saw something in her eyes that made her think, what if it were me? What if it was someone I loved? That afternoon, as the case progressed, Eleanor found herself wondering what James would have said if he were in the dock, if the situation were reversed. He had always been someone with a sharp insight into reality, someone who knew that life was full of difficult choices, but also full of pressures that often no one understood. Would he have been able to make the same decisions as her, if he had had the same opportunities? Eleanor didn't know, but she felt that, in some way, she still carried the lessons he had taught her, even without realizing it. The trial ended with a guilty verdict, but with the possibility of psychological treatment and support. Eleanor knew that the woman wasn't just being punished, she was being helped to rebuild her life. It was a difficult decision, but one that somehow she knew was more aligned with the idea of justice she had begun to build for herself. Over time, she became better known for her sensitive approach, for giving people space to express themselves, for seeking the stories behind the actions. Of course, there were those who criticized her for being too emotional or too soft. But for Eleanor, what mattered was that she was trying to be true to her own truth. She couldn't change everything at once, but each judgment was an opportunity to move closer to a truer, more humane form of justice. She knew justice would never be perfect, but perhaps over time she could help make it more compassionate. Time passed, and Eleanor continued on her journey. Each case brought a challenge, a new perspective, and a new opportunity for growth. She was no longer just a judge who read out sentences. She was someone who understood profoundly the impact her decisions could have on people's lives. They weren't just numbers or articles of law. They were stories of entire lives, of human beings who passed before her, with their own dreams, traumas, and challenges. She learned that true justice doesn't reside only in applying the law in a cold and impersonal way, but in recognizing that each person has a story, and often these stories are more complex than judgments at first glance. She still believed in the system, but now she knew her role was to make it more inclusive, more compassionate, and above all, more humane. One day, walking to the court, Eleanor paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. The clouds were parting, and the sun was beginning to shine. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that at least she was making a difference in some way. She couldn't change the world at once, but she knew she could make small changes, small corrections every day. It was an ongoing work, a constant effort to improve, to evolve. She entered the court, already knowing that the next case wouldn't be easy. But now she felt more prepared. She knew she could listen more, understand more, and above all, give people the chance to express themselves, to show who they really were. She was no longer the judge who merely applied the law. She was someone who applied justice in a way that took into account the humanity of each individual who crossed the courtroom. In the end, Eleanor knew it didn't matter if others considered her idealistic or emotional. What mattered was that she was doing what she believed was right. She wasn't just following the system, she was trying to reform it, to make it better for everyone. And in doing so, she knew she was honoring not only the role of judge, but the person she had become. Wiser, more empathetic, and more willing to fight for justice that was truly just. As the court prepared for another judgment, Eleanor sat on her bench with a sense of tranquility, knowing she was in some way making a difference. She looked towards the horizon, where the sun now shone brightly, and made a final promise to herself. She would continue to fight for justice, but more than that, for the humanity that each person carries within them. Because, ultimately, true justice wasn't just about what happened inside a courtroom. It was about how she could touch the lives of all those who passed through it, offering the opportunity to be heard, to be understood, and most importantly, to be treated as human. And with this conviction in her heart, she prepared for the next case. After all, the journey in pursuit of justice, however difficult, was only just beginning.